Welcome everyone to another round of Quilts Equals Art Equals Quilts Artist Talks. My name is Davana Robedee. I'm the program director here at the Schweinfurth Art Center. Today I'm talking to Kevin Womack, whose quilt Equilibrium recently won Best in Show. And if you want to come see the quilt in person, you can visit us until January 9th. So Kevin, tell us a little bit about your quilt Equilibrium.
I have been working on Equilibrium since about 2014, believe it or not. Part of my process, sometimes things get put aside for long periods of time until I can figure out exactly what I want to do. The imagery I have been working with since about 2007, and I have several pieces, not all finished, that use the same big circle and the line through it. I had been working on one piece of the fabric, and I took it to a monoprinting class because I knew they would have a huge board that I could work on it and dye paint without too much trouble. I don't have a huge setup at home for that kind of thing. So when I painted on the right side with the red in it is the original fabric I worked on. I then dye painted on that. And when I lifted that off of the monoprint board, I had layers of stuff left on the board that I was like, oh my God, I've got to print this as well. So I used another piece of fabric I had and then dye painted into that to make the left side. The problem was they were not equal. I had already decided I kind of wanted to do a diptych of, it's kind of light, dark, good, bad. That was the idea. So the reason it took so long to get to this stage is I was trying to figure out exactly what to do to make them equal size.
Tell me a little bit about what the light and dark represents, or are you leaving it open to viewer interpretation, or did you have, like, why do you feel like you're seeking balance?
Well, there's good and bad in every situation. If you read my artist statement on my website, I kind of go into that a little bit. You have to seek the good in the dark, the bad things that happen to you. You have to try to find some good in that, or at least for me, that's how I operate. And then realize that the good that happens, there's also a tiny bit of bad that could be in there as well. It's all about balance for me. So that was the whole idea.
And you were talking a little bit about the process, and I know that several of your other works are using monoprinting. What drew you to this way of working?
I have been dyeing fabrics for several years, like shibori and tub dyeing and things like that. What I really like about the monoprinting and dye painting is I can really express, I can make those marks. I want to put my marks into the cloth, and some of the marks on the pieces are writing, but you're not meant to know what that writing is. It's asemic, I believe is how you pronounce it, writing. And I know what the words mean when I'm writing, but I don't necessarily want the viewer to know. It's just kind of putting intention and my feeling into the work as I'm making it.
And you have another piece that also made it into the exhibit called Lament. Can you tell us a little bit about this work?
This one is probably my most political work to date. I started thinking about early in the pandemic, probably March, April, somewhere around then. You see all the death tolls rising. And that led me to think about coffins piling up. So I thought originally I would print my own coffin fabric, but that did not go so successfully in my printing process. So at the same time I tried printing the coffins, I used the same dye color, the red, to color another piece of fabric that I had. It's actually print on demand fabric from some of my imagery. So that's where the red stripes come from, the red on that fabric. And then I used another piece of print on demand fabric for the white stripes. And it took me probably 3 or 4 days to design the flag canton with the coffins on it. There are several layers of Photoshop work on that. I used a photograph, one of my photographs of dirt as the layer behind the coffins, so that what gives them the orangey color behind the coffins. So it was quite a process. When I got the flag canton back from the printer, it was too precious. It just looked too new compared to the red and the white that I already had. So I had the idea of putting the dyed sheer over that to make it all cohesive. But once I laid the whole sheer over the whole thing, I was like, oh my God, this is a great veil, which goes to the theme of the darkness of the work. And what I was trying to relay about my sadness of the situation, the political situation, the COVID-19 pandemic, it all, Black Lives Matter was happening at the same time. The George Floyd murder was there. So there was a lot going on, and that Lament is my response to all of that.
Yeah, I've talked to a lot of other artists about this, and many are finding themselves at this point where they have to dismiss or confront the pandemic and their feelings about it in some way, whether or not they choose not to or whether they choose to. And there's lots of reasons for either or, but the scale of this tragedy, I don't think we'll comprehend or be able to process for years and years to come. The loss is.
I agree.
Yeah, and we're all sort of, as creatives, trying to wrap our minds around it through our process. Was any part of this process cathartic for you?
Oh, absolutely. And the same with equilibrium. Once I'm printing and making those marks and writing the words, it's cathartic for me. It gets my feelings out, my anxiety or whatever I'm feeling. It could be joy. It could be anything. But that's another reason I like the monoprinting so much. I can be very expressive with it. And that helps me.
Yeah, the work you are known best for are works that are, I would say, incredibly visually beautiful from far away, but then up close, specifically your bed series, birthing bed, death bed, wedding bed, sick bed, dream bed, married bed, baby bed, like all of those pieces. And then you get into the imagery that you've pieced, and it changes. Can you talk a little bit about that push-pull between, the darkness and the light, or the way that you use extreme values to make commentary on things?
Sure, that is exactly part of, I collaborated with quilter Eleanor McCain on that series, and that was totally part of the process. We want it to be visually beautiful, visually stunning, but when you get drawn in, there's some very dark imagery. It's a comment on how the bed is related to different aspects of our lives. So there's lots of dark things, and I think we both enjoy putting those little surprises in there to draw the viewer in, and think about, they all relate to whatever the theme of the bed we were working on was. So, and it's also part of, also in my artist statement, I talk about the push and pull of the hard and the soft. I love using hard imagery on the ultimate comfort item of quilt, the softness of the quilt.
Yeah, what do you think a quilt can do that like a photo collage cannot, or a painting cannot? What is it about quilting that can say more for you?
Well, what drew me to it initially is the familial connection, the connection to history, but what it adds to artwork is the texture. At the actual quilting of the piece can add texture, dimension, and just give it another layer that a flat 2D object cannot have.
You have another series that I'm interested in because, as we just discussed earlier, I grew up not far from New Orleans, and you have a series called New Orleans that's really interesting. And tell us a little bit about that and where you were drawing your inspiration.
Well, it kind of ties into everything else. New Orleans is my favorite place to visit in the U.S. There's no place like it around. Any excuse for a party, a parade, anything, they're up for it. And that's totally my aesthetic. So, but it also goes to the hard, soft. Lots of times I'm drawn to shadows in the city, like fence shadows. There's a piece called Vines that are vines in the winter hanging over a balcony that's pretty the spiky. I like lots of spiky, again, for the hard aspect of things. So I try to find things like that. I love that there's hidden courtyards in the French Quarter that you don't really know that are there when you're walking by somewhere. And you see all this razor wire over top of things, fences, which is very hard imagery, which speaks to my aesthetic. It just turns me on for some reason, but I know that there's a hidden beauty beyond. So that's also kind of what I was thinking with Equilibrium. There's lots of that hard imagery, but it speaks to the softness and the good as well.
Yeah, I always find New Orleans to be a kind of gritty city.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
There's a certain amount of dilapidation just everywhere for some reason, and that's everyone, you kind of take it for granted that that's there and just a part of the life.
And it's beautiful.
It's beautiful, and it exists on this like edge of like resistance to nature, and nature seems to be always trying to take back over the city, and the people are just like, no, we're gonna live here anyway. Almost
right, like we're doing it.
Futile attempt against nature that we continue.
Yeah.
And yet still with a sense of humor the city has.
Absolutely.
Can you tell me a little bit about like how you got into quilting? Were you always working in this way?
I have always been interested in art. I wanted to switch my major halfway through college to art, but my dad wasn't having any of that. He wanted me to be sensible and practical, so I just stuck with the computer science that I was doing. But I started taking a bunch of art electives in college. So I've done metals and jewelry, oil painting. Photography was my first love, and darkroom work, black and white darkroom work was my first love. And then after college, I continued with adult education classes at the Academy of Fine Arts here. Pottery, oil painting, things like that. But I had already started quilting 1986. My grandmother was kind of the impetus for that. She had been having me cross stitch. We were doing candle wicking. I should say that my mother passed away when I was 15. And so I got really close to her mother, this grandmother. So, and I kind of knew that I wanted to spend as much time with her as possible because I knew how short life could be. So that's why we started doing these things. But my grandmother had a quilt top that my great grandmother had pieced, but never quilted. And my grandmother was not a quilter, but she knew how to put the frame together, and she wanted to get it quilted to give to one of her children. So I was like, well, how hard can this be? I've been cross-stitching, candle wicking. We'll do this. So I helped her with that one. I decided to make my first one out of family clothing in that same half rectangle, cut diagonally, loose cut pattern. I used a brown paper grocery bag as a loose pattern, cut with scissors. The seams are horrible. There's puckers, but everybody has to start somewhere. So that kind of got me started. And once we finished quilting that one, my grandmother did the binding. I said, that's it. I'm never making another quilt again. Went to bed and dreamed of quilts and the family clothing, the memories that were tied to that. I don't know what it is. I just got bit by the bug, and I have been quilting ever since.
I feel like this story is very common of someone saying, "Oh, how hard can this be?" and then getting into it and be like, "Oh, very, very hard, actually, very hard."
Yeah, I think what kept me going is my math and science background. I really like the geometry, figuring out the templates. So that kind of kept me interested as well.
It's interesting because I know quilters who are like, yes, figuring out the templates, the geometry, the math, very, very precise. And then there are the others who are just sort of like incredibly self-taught with it and have like weird, obsessions and somehow do the same, but without any of the process. But lots of respect because I can't go there myself.
Yeah, I kind of straddle the line. I've done traditional quilting for years, and I still occasionally make traditional quilts more as a color study and pattern play exercise than anything. So since I've started working with my own fabrics that you see around me, it's been kind of a struggle. I kind of want to cut them up into these tiny pieces, but they don't necessarily visually make that much sense once I do that. So now I'm trying to use big pieces like here, because I kind of worked on the composition as I printed it. So it kind of needs to stay whole. So there's that dichotomy between cutting it up in really small pieces or letting it be what it wants to be and using it.
That is, I think, a conversation that I haven't had with enough artists who are also sort of surface designers. And I talked a little bit to Jeanette DeNicholas Meyer about this, her hesitation to cut the fabric. She's like, because I made this one of a kind piece that has like 20 different processes on it that's actually really hard to do. And now I'm going to cut it up. And he talks about like the sacred and the profane in those two acts, like the sacredness of this art object, but then you slice and dice to make something else with.
Yes.
Yeah, it's definitely, I can imagine, really hard to determine what needs to stay and what lovely piece you have to murder.
Right. And some people have no problem. I know Pat Pauly can just whip through things and chop them up. And I struggle with that. I'm getting better, but I struggle with doing that.
Yes, I have seen Pat at work, and she slices and dices with no mercy. No mercy to the fabric.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I have to realize I can print more. I can make more, cut it up. It has to get in here. Just cut it up.
Yeah. Well, there's something to letting it live too. There's some tension there.
Right.
So finding that balance. Can you tell me a little bit about what you're doing next? What you're working on after this allegory series that you have going?
I think allegories is probably going to continue the rest of my life, ever how long that's going to be, because they're really personal stories that I don't necessarily want the viewer to know exactly what I'm talking about. What I'm trying to do is make the emotion relatable so that people get a sense of the emotion and they can interpret it however they want. They can tell their own story through the piece. So I think allegories is probably going to be something that I work on forever. As far as what's next, I have tons of things that are ready for quilting. It seems I'm always doing something. I also teach. So doing all that, getting all the classwork, there's always something to do that takes me away from making my art. So I just have to fit it in wherever. I have stacks and stacks and stacks of printed cloth around me in the studio that I, pull out whenever I have time and just start a new piece. So that's what's next, just continuation.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Kevin. It was wonderful to talk to you and hear all about your process. If you want to learn more about Kevin's work, you can visit his website. And please come in to see the show before it comes down January 9th. Thank you.
Thank you.